Hello, welcome to the AhvalTV. Here we have Blaise Mitsal today from Bipartisan Center in Washington, D.C. think tank, one of the leading Washington, D.C. think tank. Welcome to the program, Blaise.
Thanks for having me, Ilhan.
Thank you for your time. You just published very important article on Bipartisan Center on Wednesday, and you are talking about off-the-record meeting at the Senate, and it is on Turkey, and it's on potential sanctions on Turkey. All readers can go and see it via Ahval online news or Bipartisan Center. We did a recap on this very important piece. My first question is, can you tell our viewers what would be the significance of this latest off-the-record meeting, and what does Treasury official joining that meeting means?
Sure. So as you just pointed out, Ilhan, there was this past Wednesday a hearing of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee was entitled "Turkey and the Way Ahead," which is not particularly surprising by itself, given what's going on in Afrin and continuous issues that arise in the U.S.-Turkish relationship. It only makes sense that the Senate is interested in what's happening in Turkey and trying to figure out what to do next. But what was remarkable about this is, first of all, two things. First, that it was a closed briefing, closed hearing, which largely means that it was, the public could not attend. We don't know what was said. We're not going to know what was said. And these sorts of hearings are really reserved usually for sharing classified or sensitive information or having sensitive discussions that we don't want others to know about. And then what was also the second thing that was striking was the composition. We had someone from the Department of State, which is obviously normal, someone from the Department of Defense, which makes sense. But then we saw something that we haven't seen in a lot of previous discussions about Turkey in Congress, which is someone from the Department of Treasury, and specifically someone from the Department of Treasury that deals in national security issues, deals in sanctions, and deals in financial regulation. And that really raises the question, what was that person doing there? And there's a couple of possible answers. One is obviously with the recent conviction of in the Zarab case, but not of Zarab himself. There's some discussion of Turkey's role in financial crimes like evading sanctions on Iran. But I think the more interesting and more realistic issue is probably that there's at least some appetite in Congress for discussing if there are sanctions that can and should be put in place on Turkey, whether it's for a potential attack on Manbij, what it's doing in Afrin, or for other reasons.
Interesting. So you are saying that this Halkbank, Zarab, and Mehmet Hakan Atilla case, and for a long time it has been discussed, but you are now saying that it is also possible that members of Congress might be discussing that due to Afrin incursion or operation and Manbij situation, there could be another reason for Congress to go for potential sanctions on Turkey.
Potentially, with the caveat that we don't know what was said at the hearing. This is only stipulation based on the fact that it was closed and it included someone from the Department of Treasury. But I think for a long time you've seen the U.S. Be very careful in its treatment of Turkey. In all our public statements, we talk about the importance of this relationship. We talk about how close ties are between the U.S. and Turkey. And U.S. officials in the Bush administration and the Obama administration and now in the Trump administration have chosen their words very carefully. They have not been very critical of Turkey publicly. And this might be a signal that at least in the Senate, there might be some interest in changing that course and seeing that trying to maintain good relations with Turkey hasn't changed anything. It has only seen the U.S. and Turkey grow further apart in foreign policy. It has only seen Turkey backslide more on democracy, and maybe some tougher measures might now be warranted, and perhaps there was a discussion of the role that sanctions could play as part of a tougher strategy. But again, this is all conjecture on my part.
Sure. What is your feeling about the environment in the Congress or Senate? Is this, we know that there is really big allergy against Turkey. Turkish administration wind is very strong. But do you think you can give us an estimate what would be the support for this kind of sanctions at the Congress, either side, if it were to come to, the bill or proposal?
I think it's really hard to estimate right now. I do believe that, and I work at the Bipartisan Policy Center, Erdogan has been a great force for bipartisanship in Washington. I think there's a lot of alarm among both Republicans and Democrats about what is happening in Turkey for maybe for different reasons. Some people care more about the human rights and the domestic situation and the backsliding on democracy. Others care more about the fact that Turkey seems to feel comfortable threatening U.S. forces in Manbij. And so that's also part of the difficulty here is there might be general agreement that there is a problem in the U.S.-Turkish relationship, but it might not sort of carry over into specifics about what that problem is or what we do with it. But that being said, we saw a couple months ago, for example, Ben Cardin, the ranking Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, sent a letter to the administration saying that he believes Turkey should be sanctioned if it purchases S-400 missile system from Russia. A number of senators signed on to that. And so I think if things get pushed far enough, there will be appetite to do something. The question is, will there be agreement on what that something is?
We hear a lot about this Magnitsky Act. We primarily heard about this in recent years about the Russians, sanctions on Russians, targeted sanctions. Now it is being discussed about Turkish administration officials. What can you tell us about this? What this Magnitsky Act has to do with Turkey at this point?
Sure. So a very brief history. Sergei Magnitsky was a Russian lawyer who was jailed and beaten and eventually killed in a Russian prison. And the original Magnitsky Act was very specifically about having the U.S. State Department identify Russian officials who were involved in that act of killing Magnitsky. And it does two things. It freezes any assets they have in the U.S. financial system, and it bars them from traveling to the United States. Now, that framework was so attractive that a couple of years later, 2 years ago, Congress passed the Global Magnitsky Act. And that means that these same punishments, so freezing of assets in the United States and banning travel to the United States, can be applied by the State Department to any foreign official, any foreign actor, any foreign individual that is found to have either committed human rights abuses or be involved in corruption. And so now you have the possibility, we've seen this applied to other Russian officials, we've seen this applied to some people in Myanmar, some people in North Korea recently. And so now there's the possibility, or there's discussion of the fact that between what we know about corruption in Turkey that came out of the Zarab trial, the Halkbank trial, what we know about some human rights abuses, what has been reported, for example, about torture of suspects detained after the coup, there could be grounds for going after individual members of the Turkish government, maybe individual members of the Turkish business community on grounds of human rights abuse or corruption, and applying these sanctions to them, which would again bar them from coming to the United States and freeze any financial assets they have here.
Okay, that's very, very important. Seems like it, and it sounds like very much related to Turkey and the issues surrounding with Turkish relations. Let me move to a couple other hot topics. There are so many issues. I think I can keep asking you questions for about few hours here, but I know we have a very limited time. Let me go to this hot spot in Afrin and Manbij, and also Secretary Tillerson is going Turkey. Most likely McMaster might be going to Turkey this weekend. Still no confirmation to me, if you have anything. Can you tell us, first of all, do you expect any kind of hot conflict between Turkey or Turkish-backed rebels with the US or US-backed Kurdish fighters in northern Syria?
I certainly hope not, and I think that the U.S. side has been trying to do a lot to de-escalate or decrease the potential for such a conflict. We've seen high-ranking U.S. military officials go to the Manbij border. We've seen them deploy more U.S. troops to the border position as an attempt to dissuade Turkey from attacking. And hopefully we've also the United States has sent a strong message in the military strike it carried out against pro-Assad forces that attacked an SDF base that housed U.S. troops as well, showing how strongly the U.S. will respond to any attack on its partner or its own forces. But that's all sending signals. It's not clear, at least, how much Washington is actually telling Turkey in its communications with Ankara. And so hopefully Tillerson's trip, General McMaster's trip, if he goes, will provide an opportunity for a very direct message about how devastating to the relationship a Turkish incursion in Manbij will be. But we see that so far, at least, President Erdogan has not dialed back his rhetoric. I think he said just 2 days ago that Turkey is going to Manbij and we're going to hand back the territory to the people to whom it belongs to. So the U.S. is working very hard to de-escalate the situation, but at least in the rhetoric coming out of Turkey, it doesn't seem to be having any effect, and that's problematic.
On Afrin, it is the 3-week, it finishes today. How do you think the U.S. is going to do anything about this? Is going to increase rhetoric or anything coming out of Washington?
I think it's very clear that the U.S. is disinterested in the outcome in Afrin, or at least not willing to do anything about it. It has said from the beginning that it recognizes Turkey's legitimate security interests there, that it has nothing to do with the YPG forces that are there, that those are separate forces, that it does not have U.S. troops or interests present in Afrin. And so I think in large part, the U.S. is willing to tolerate that. And I think the hope in Washington is that Turkey will be happy with just Afrin. But the danger is that Ankara misinterprets that and says, well, if they were okay with Afrin, then maybe they really will be okay with Manbij. And so I think there's a danger there.
Final question. Can you give us your assessment of current Turkey-U.S. relation under these, various issues?
It remains an alliance, but on paper only, by the mere fact that we are both members of NATO. But it seems that there are very few, if any, places where U.S. and Turkish interests align. And it seems that there are no values that we share in common anymore. And so, it is an alliance, but not a partnership. That's the way I put it.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. This is a great insights and is very valuable. Is going to be very useful for our readers to understand Turkey-U.S. relations and issues around it without getting trapped by conspiracy stories and other fantastic ideas. This is really, really great. Thanks again for your time.
Thanks for having me, Ilhan.